What would you do if the person you kicked out of your store turned out to be the one who signs your paycheck? Most people never get tested like this. Most people never find out what they're really made of when nobody important is watching. But on a freezing Tuesday morning in Chicago, 37 employees at a luxury department store were about to face exactly that test, and not a single one of them knew it was happening. This is the story of Richard Albridge. And I'm going to warn you right now, the ending of this story is not what you think it is. It's not even close. Because what Richard discovered that day didn't just shock him. It broke something inside him that he spent the next 3 years trying to put back together. But let me start where it matters. Let me start with the shoes. Richard Albridge built his empire the way most empires get built, one humiliation at a time. When he was 19, he walked into a department store on Michigan Avenue wearing his only pair of jeans, a hoodie with a coffee stain on the sleeve, and work boots that had seen better days about 2 years prior. He wasn't there to browse. He had saved up exactly $420, every cent from 3 months of double shifts at a warehouse, because he wanted to buy his mother a proper winter coat. She'd been wearing the same thin jacket for 6 years. The zipper didn't even work anymore. She just held it closed with her hand. So Richard walked in, found the women's coat section, and started looking at the options. And that's when a sales associate, a woman in her 40s with perfectly pressed clothes and a smile that could cut glass, walked up to him and said, and I quote, "Because Richard has told this story 1,000 times and he remembers every word," she said, "Honey, I think you might be more comfortable at the store across the street. They have more accessible options." More accessible. That was the word she used. Accessible. Like a ramp. Like something designed for people who can't reach the regular entrance. Richard looked at her. He looked down at his boots. He looked at the $420 folded in his front pocket. And he left. He didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He just turned around, walked out the door, and bought his mother a coat at a discount store 3 blocks away. It was a fine coat. His mother loved it. She wore it for 8 years. But Richard never forgot that woman's face. Not because he was angry. Not because he wanted revenge. But because in that moment, he learned something that would shape everything he did for the rest of his life. He learned that people make decisions about your value in the first 3 seconds they see you. Not based on your character. Not based on your story. Not based on the $420 of honest money in your pocket. Based on your shoes. Based on your jacket. Based on whether or not you look like you belong. And that lesson, that tiny, humiliating, 60-second interaction in a department store in 1991, became the foundation of a $2.3 billion retail empire. Because Richard Albridge didn't just build stores. He built a philosophy. Every Albridge location, and there were 47 of them across the United States by 2018, operated under something he called the first face policy. It was simple. It was radical. And for the retail industry, it was borderline insane. The policy stated that every single person who walks through the door of an Albridge store gets treated like the most important customer of the day. Period. Didn't matter if they were wearing a $3,000 suit or a $3 t-shirt from a thrift store. Didn't matter if they came in pushing a stroller or pushing a shopping cart full of everything they owned. The first face policy meant you smiled. You greeted. You offered help. And if that customer wanted to try on a $12,000 watch just to see how it felt on their wrist, you handed it to them with the same enthusiasm you'd show to someone who'd been shopping there for 20 years. Richard trained every employee personally for the first decade. He flew to every new store opening. He stood in the break room and told that story about the coat and the woman and the word, accessible. And employees believed in it. They bought in. The turnover rate at Albridge stores was the lowest in the luxury retail industry for 11 consecutive years. Customer satisfaction scores were through the roof. The brand became synonymous with something rare in that world, genuine warmth. But here's the thing about principles. They're easy to hold when someone's watching. They're easy to perform when the boss is in the building, when the cameras are rolling, when the quarterly review is next week. The real test of a principle is what happens when you think nobody who matters is paying attention. And by 2018, Richard Albridge was 66 years old. He'd stepped back from daily operations 5 years earlier. He had a CEO running things, a sharp woman named Patricia Langford, Harvard MBA, 15 years of luxury retail experience, hand-picked by Richard himself. The company was doing well. Revenue was up. Expansion was on track. But Richard had this feeling. You know the kind of feeling I'm talking about. It's not based on data. It's not based on reports. It's that itch in the back of your skull that tells you something has shifted, something you can't see on a spreadsheet. He'd been visiting stores less frequently. When he did visit, everything was perfect. Too perfect. Employees snapped to attention. Managers appeared out of nowhere with rehearsed smiles. The floors were spotless. The music was at the right volume. Everything was performed. And Richard, who had spent 40 years reading people the way a mechanic reads an engine, by listening for the sounds that shouldn't be there, started to wonder, what happens in my stores when I'm not there? What happens when the person walking through the door doesn't look like a mystery shopper or a regional manager or a billionaire? What happens when the person walking through the door looks like nobody? So he came up with a plan. And honestly, this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because what Richard did next wasn't just a test of his employees. Looking back, it was a test of himself. He just didn't know it yet. The plan was straightforward. Richard would disguise himself as a homeless man, not a quirky, movie homeless kind of look, but the real thing. Dirty clothes. Unwashed hair. A worn-out backpack. The kind of appearance that makes people cross the street. He would enter 3 of his own stores, in 3 different cities, on 3 different days. He'd interact with employees. He'd see how he was treated. And he'd document everything. He hired a Hollywood makeup artist. Not a costume designer from a party store, an actual film professional named David Chen who had worked on 3 Oscar-nominated movies. David spent 6 hours on Richard. The transformation was shocking. Richard's wife, Margaret, walked past him in their own kitchen and didn't recognize him. She actually screamed when he spoke and she realized who it was. They aged his skin. They added grime under his fingernails that looked like it had been building for months. They gave him a slight limp, a prosthetic insert in his left shoe that altered his gait. His clothes were authentic. Not ripped designer jeans pretending to be worn. Actual clothes pulled from a donation bin. A jacket with a broken zipper, and if you're paying attention, you already noticed that detail. A jacket with a broken zipper. Just like his mother's coat. Richard noticed it too. He almost chose a different jacket. But something made him keep it. Something about closing a circle. Or maybe opening one. Now, before we go into what happened at the stores, I need to tell you about 3 employees. Because this story isn't really about Richard. It's about them. The first one is Marcus Williams. 24 years old. Worked at the Albridge flagship store in Chicago for 2 years. Marcus grew up on the South Side. His grandmother raised him after his mother went to prison when he was 7. He got the job at Albridge because his grandmother's neighbor knew someone in HR, and Marcus showed up to the interview in a borrowed suit that was 2 sizes too big, but he showed up 30 minutes early, and he answered every question like his life depended on it. Because it did. Marcus was in the process of saving money to bring his mother, who was now out of prison and sober for 3 years, to live with him and his grandmother in a 2-bedroom apartment. He needed $14,000 for the deposit, first and last month's rent, and basic furniture. He had saved $11,000. He was $3,000 short. He worked every overtime shift available. He never called in sick. His customer satisfaction ratings were the highest in the store. He believed in the first face policy not because Richard Albridge told him to, but because Marcus knew what it felt like to be looked at like you were nothing. He knew that feeling in his bones. The second employee is Vanessa Torres. 31 years old. Assistant floor manager. She'd been with the company for 5 years and had applied for the floor manager position 3 times. Denied each time. The current floor manager, a man named Derek Holloway, had held the position for 7 years and showed no signs of leaving. Vanessa was smart, organized, and deeply frustrated. She felt stuck. And when people feel stuck, something happens to them. The idealism that got them through the door starts to corrode. The principles that felt inspiring during training start to feel naive. Vanessa didn't stop caring about customers. But she started prioritizing. She developed an internal algorithm, we all do this, by the way, whether we admit it or not, where she would assess a customer in the first few seconds and decide how much energy to invest. High-value looking customers got the full Vanessa experience. Everyone else got adequate. Professional, but adequate. And the third employee is Derek Holloway himself. Floor manager. 43 years old. 12 years with the company. Derek was what you'd call a company man on paper. In reality, Derek was a politician. He knew how to manage up, meaning he was exceptional at making his bosses think everything was running perfectly, even when it wasn't. He knew exactly when regional managers were scheduled to visit. He knew which metrics Patricia Langford cared about. He ran his floor the way a movie set runs. Everything looks incredible from the camera angle, but step 2 feet to the left and you see the plywood and the duct tape. Derek had quietly implemented an unofficial practice that he never put in writing and never discussed in meetings. He called it redirecting. When someone came into the store who clearly, in Derek's assessment, wasn't going to buy anything. A teenager in a hoodie, an elderly person who seemed confused, or yes, a homeless person. Derek would assign the newest, lowest-ranking employee to assist them. Which really meant, follow them, be polite, and gently guide them toward the exit. He never said, kick them out. He never used those words. He said, redirect. And because Derek was good at managing up, nobody above him knew this was happening. Or if they suspected, they didn't want to look too closely, because Derek's floor had the highest sales per square foot in the entire chain. Numbers were good. So nobody asked uncomfortable questions. Alright, let's go to day 1. Chicago. The flagship store. November 13, 2018. 7:45 in the morning. Temperature was 28 degrees. Richard arrived at the store at 9:55, 5 minutes before opening. He sat on a bench across the street, watching employees arrive. He noticed something small but telling. The employees who entered through the front door walked quickly, heads down, no conversation. The energy was mechanical. Not hostile. Not cold. Just absent. Like people arriving at a place they had to be, not a place they wanted to be. At 10:08, Richard crossed the street and entered the store. And here's what he noticed first: the greeter, a young woman named Amy, was on her phone. She was standing at the greeting podium, the same podium that Richard had personally designed, the podium that was supposed to symbolize the moment a customer becomes a guest, and she was scrolling. She didn't look up when the door opened. She didn't look up when Richard walked past her. She didn't look up until Richard was already 15 feet inside the store. And then she looked up, saw him, and her face did something that Richard would later describe as the most honest 3 seconds I've ever witnessed. Her eyes went from his face to his clothes to his backpack to his shoes and back to his face. And in that 3-second scan, Amy made a decision. She didn't smile. She didn't greet him. She looked back down at her phone. Now, and this is important, Amy wasn't a bad person. She was 20 years old. She was working part-time while taking classes at community college. She was tired. She'd been on her feet since 6 that morning because she also worked at a coffee shop before her Albridge shift. She was doing what most 20-year-olds would do. She was doing what most people would do. And that's precisely what made it so devastating to Richard. Because the failure wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was casual. It was the quiet, almost unconscious way that a human being can look at another human being and simply decide they don't exist. Richard moved through the men's department. He touched a cashmere sweater on a display table, a $1,200 piece that he had personally approved for the fall collection. Within 11 seconds, a sales associate appeared. Not to help him. To watch him. The associate, a man in his 30s named Paul, positioned himself about 10 feet away, pretending to straighten a display that didn't need straightening. He kept glancing at Richard's hands, watching to see if anything went into the backpack. Richard understood what was happening. He'd seen this choreography before in other stores, years ago, before he built his own. The shadow follow. The polite surveillance. The assumption wrapped in professionalism. He picked up the sweater, held it up to his chest like he was checking the size, and looked directly at Paul. "Excuse me," Richard said. "Do you have this in a large?" And here is where something happened that Richard did not expect. Paul didn't ignore him. Paul didn't redirect him. Paul walked over, took the sweater gently from Richard's hands, and said, with a voice that was polite but carried an unmistakable undertone, "Sir, that piece is $1,200. Can I show you something from our essentials line? We have some very nice options starting around $60. Now, let me pause here. Because I need you to understand what just happened from Richard's perspective. Paul didn't say, 'Get out.' Paul didn't say, 'You can't afford this.' Paul, in his own mind, was probably being helpful. He was probably thinking, this poor guy wandered in off the street. Let me save him the embarrassment of asking the price and not being able to pay. Let me point him towards something reasonable. And that? That is the most dangerous form of prejudice. It's the kind that disguises itself as kindness. It's the kind that the person doing it genuinely believes is compassionate. Paul thought he was being nice. Paul thought he was doing the man in the dirty jacket a favor. And that's exactly what made it so insidious. Because what Paul actually did was make a financial judgment about a stranger based entirely on appearance and then act on that judgment while believing he was being generous. Richard didn't react. He simply said, "I'll keep looking, thank you." And he moved on. Over the next 45 minutes, Richard walked through every department in the flagship store. He counted his interactions. 7 employees saw him. Of those 7, 2 ignored him completely. 3 watched him like he might steal something. 1, Paul, engaged but redirected him to cheaper items. And one treated him differently. Marcus Williams. Marcus was restocking a display near the accessories department when Richard walked by. And Marcus did something that none of the other 6 employees did. He looked at Richard's face. Not his clothes. Not his backpack. Not his shoes. His face. "Good morning, sir," Marcus said. And it wasn't performative. It wasn't the corporate greeting that gets drilled into you during orientation week. Marcus said it the way you'd say good morning to a neighbor. Natural. Warm. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world to say to another human being who just walked past you. Richard stopped. "Good morning," he said back. "Cold one today, huh?" Marcus smiled. "Man, it's brutal out there. You staying warm?" And right there. Right in that tiny exchange. Richard felt something crack in his chest. Because Marcus didn't ask if he needed help finding something. He didn't assess his purchasing potential. He asked if he was warm. He asked about his well-being. Like a person. Like a human being talking to another human being. They chatted for about 3 minutes. Marcus mentioned that the store had a restroom in the back if Richard needed it, and that there was a coffee machine in the customer lounge area, help yourself, it's free for everyone." Richard noted that Marcus said, "For everyone." Not, "For customers." For everyone. When Richard moved on, he walked past Derek Holloway's office. The door was open. Derek was inside, and he had clearly been watching on the floor monitors. Because less than 2 minutes after Richard left Marcus's area, Derek called Marcus over the radio. Richard heard it because he was standing near a service desk with a radio on it. Derek said, "Marcus, the individual in the green jacket, just keep an eye on him. If he's not purchasing, go ahead and redirect." Redirect. There was that word again. Marcus's response, which Richard also heard, was, "Copy that." But here's what happened next. Marcus did not redirect Richard. Marcus went back to his restocking. He didn't follow Richard. He didn't guide him to the exit. He quietly, without announcement or confrontation, disobeyed a direct order from his floor manager. And he did it knowing that if Derek noticed, there would be consequences. Richard left the Chicago store at 11:15 that morning. He sat in the back of his car. He had a driver waiting 2 blocks away, and he didn't speak for 20 minutes. His driver, a man named George who had worked for Richard for 9 years, finally looked in the rearview mirror and said, "Bad day, sir." And Richard said, "I don't know yet, George. I don't know yet." Day 2. Dallas. The Albridge store in the Highland Park Village Shopping Center. November 15, 2018. This store was smaller than the flagship but catered to an even wealthier clientele. Average transaction value was about 3 times the company average. The manager here was a woman named Christine Park. Richard knew Christine. She'd been with the company for 8 years and had won the Internal Excellence Award twice. On paper, her store was flawless. Richard entered at 11:20 in the morning. The greeting experience was better here. A young man at the podium actually said, "Welcome to Albridge," when Richard walked in. But the greeting was automatic. The young man was looking past Richard as he said it, already scanning for the next person coming through the door. Like a motion sensor that triggers a recorded message. You walk past, it talks, but it's not talking to you. Richard spent about 30 minutes on the floor. The pattern was similar to Chicago but with a notable difference. In Dallas, employees didn't just watch him or redirect him. They actively avoided him. He would approach a display, and the nearest associate would find a reason to walk to the other side of the floor. It was like he had a force field. Not hostile. Just invisible. Nobody wanted to be the one standing next to the homeless man when a real customer walked in. Richard tried an experiment. He stood in front of a display case containing watches ranging from $8,000 to $45,000. He stood there for 11 minutes. In a luxury retail environment, standing in front of a display case for more than about 90 seconds typically triggers an approach from a sales associate. 11 minutes. Nobody came. He could see 3 associates from where he was standing. All 3 were aware of him. All 3 chose to help other customers who had arrived after Richard and were standing further from the display case. This wasn't a staffing issue. This was a choice. After 11 minutes, Richard flagged down an associate himself, a woman named Jennifer. "Excuse me, could I see that watch? The one with the blue face?" Jennifer smiled, professionally, not warmly, and said, "That's the Rosenthal chronograph. It retails for $32,000. She didn't open the case. She stated the price like a bouncer stating a cover charge. Like the number itself was supposed to be the thing that made him leave. "I know what it costs," Richard said. "Can I see it?" Jennifer hesitated. She looked toward the back of the store, toward where Christine's office was, and then back at Richard. "I'll need to get my manager's approval for that," she said. "Store policy for pieces over $10,000. Now, Richard wrote the store policies. There was no such policy. Jennifer made it up on the spot. She invented a rule to avoid putting a $32,000 watch on the wrist of a man she'd already decided couldn't afford it. Richard said, "Sure, go ahead and get your manager." Jennifer disappeared into the back. She was gone for 7 minutes. When she came back, she was with Christine Park. And Christine, Excellence Award winner, 8-year veteran, one of the people Richard trusted most in his organization, walked up to Richard, and her first words were not, "How can I help you?" or, "I understand you'd like to see a piece from our collection." Her first words were, "Sir, is there something specific that brought you in today? Because we do have a community resource center about 4 blocks from here that might be able to help you with whatever you might need." A community resource center. She was directing him to a shelter. In his own store. Richard felt something in that moment that he would later struggle to articulate in interviews. He said it was like standing in a house you built with your own hands and realizing that the people living in it had repainted every wall, moved every piece of furniture, and changed every lock. It looked like his house from the outside. But inside, it was something else entirely. He left the Dallas store without another word. Day 3 was supposed to be New York. The Albridge store on Madison Avenue. But Richard almost canceled it. He called Margaret that night from the hotel in Dallas and told her what had happened. And Margaret, who had been married to Richard for 38 years and knew him better than any human being on the planet, said something that kept him going. She said, "Richard, you're not doing this to confirm what you already believe. You're doing this to find out what's true. And you're not done yet." So, Day 3. New York. November 18, 2018. The Madison Avenue store was the crown jewel. It had opened in 2012 and was designed by an architect who had also designed museums. The interior was breathtaking, Italian marble, hand-blown glass fixtures, a grand staircase that curved like a piece of sculpture. It was the kind of space that made you feel like you were entering somewhere important. Unless you looked like Richard did that morning. He entered at 2 in the afternoon, peak shopping hours. The store was busy. Well-dressed customers moved between displays. Associates floated across the floor like choreographed dancers. The energy was high. The music was a carefully curated jazz playlist that Richard himself had approved. And Richard, in his torn jacket and dirty jeans and unwashed hair, stepped through the revolving door and immediately felt the temperature change. Not the actual temperature. The social temperature. It was like dropping an ice cube into a warm bath. He could feel the ripple. Heads turned. Not all of them, most customers were absorbed in their own shopping. But the employees noticed. Oh, they noticed. And within about 45 seconds, something happened that Richard had not experienced in Chicago or Dallas. A security guard approached him. Not aggressively. Not with hostility. But with purpose. The guard, a large man named Franklin, walked up to Richard and said, quietly, "Sir, can I help you find something?" Which sounds polite. But the subtext was clear. It's the same thing a bouncer says when you're standing outside a club and you clearly don't match the dress code. "Can I help you find something?" means, "Can I help you find the exit?" Richard said, "I'm just looking around." Franklin nodded. "Of course, sir. Just want to make sure you're comfortable." And then Franklin did something remarkable in its subtlety. He positioned himself about 8 feet behind Richard and slightly to the left. Close enough to respond quickly. Far enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy. And he stayed there. For the next 35 minutes, everywhere Richard went in that store, Franklin was 8 feet behind him and slightly to the left. Like a shadow with an earpiece. Richard browsed the men's section. Franklin was there. Richard looked at shoes. Franklin was there. Richard walked to the second floor using the grand staircase, that beautiful, museum-quality staircase, and Franklin followed him up every step. And not a single other employee approached Richard during those 35 minutes. Not one. Because Franklin's presence sent a signal to the entire floor, This person is being handled. This person is being managed. You don't need to engage. The security guard is on it. Richard was in the middle of looking at a display of leather briefcases that his company sold for between $2,000 and $6,000, when he overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two associates were standing behind a display partition about 12 feet away. They couldn't see Richard, but Richard could hear them. And one of them, a woman, though Richard never identified which associate it was, said, "Did you see that guy? What is he even doing in here? This isn't a warming station." And the other one laughed. Not a mean laugh. Not a cruel laugh. A casual laugh. The kind of laugh that tells you this isn't the first time this joke has been made. The kind of laugh that suggests this is just normal. Expected. Part of the routine. The homeless person wanders in, the security guard shadows them, the associates make a joke, the person eventually leaves, and the store goes back to normal. It wasn't malice. It was culture. And that distinction is everything. Because malice you can identify, address, and punish. Culture. Culture is the water the fish don't know they're swimming in. It's the thing that happens when nobody's being deliberately cruel but everybody's participating in a system that produces cruelty as a byproduct. Richard left the New York store at 3:22 in the afternoon. He had Franklin remove the makeup in a hotel room nearby. He sat in a chair in front of a mirror, watching David peel away the prosthetics and the grime, and he felt like he was watching a mask being removed, but he wasn't sure which version was the mask. The homeless man who had been invisible? Or the billionaire who had been worshipped? He flew back to Chicago that night. And he didn't sleep. Not because he was angry. He was past anger. He was in that place beyond anger where everything gets very quiet and very clear, the way the sky gets clear and still right before a massive storm rolls in. He kept thinking about Marcus. About the one employee out of, he did the math, 23 employees he had directly interacted with across 3 stores, the one who had treated him like a person. 1 out of 23. 4.3%. In a company built entirely on the principle that every person matters. 4.3%. And he kept thinking about that word, redirect. About how Derek Holloway had built an entire shadow system for removing inconvenient human beings from the store, and how that system had operated for years, maybe longer, without anyone above him caring enough to look. And he kept thinking about Christine Park, the Excellence Award winner, directing a customer to a homeless shelter. And Jennifer, inventing policies that didn't exist. And Franklin, the shadow with the earpiece. And Amy, scrolling on her phone. And Paul, with his helpful redirect to the $60 Essentials line. None of them were villains. That was the hardest part. Not a single one of them woke up that morning and thought, "Today I'm going to be cruel to someone." They were just people. People operating inside a system that had quietly, gradually, imperceptibly rotted from the inside while all the external metrics, the sales numbers, the satisfaction scores, the revenue growth, looked better than ever. And that's when Richard made a decision that would become the most controversial thing he ever did in his career. He called Patricia Langford, his CEO, at 6 in the morning. He told her he was calling an emergency all-hands meeting at the Chicago flagship store for the following Monday. Every employee, every manager, every regional director, everyone. Patricia asked what it was about. Richard said, "I'll explain on Monday." And then he hung up and called his lawyers. Now, I need to slow down here. Because what happened at that meeting, the meeting that took place on November 26, 2018, has been told and retold so many times that the actual truth has gotten buried under layers of corporate myth and social media commentary. So I'm going to tell you what actually happened. Based on Richard's own account. Based on the accounts of employees who were there. Based on documents that were later made public during a lawsuit that we'll get to. The meeting was held in the store's event space on the 4th floor. 312 employees from the Chicago store alone were present. Another 428 joined by video from other locations. Richard walked in wearing a suit. His normal suit. His normal shoes. His normal watch, a Rosenthal chronograph with a blue face, by the way. The same watch Jennifer wouldn't let him see. He stood at the front of the room. No podium. No PowerPoint. No notes. And he started talking. He told them the story of his mother's coat. Many of the newer employees had never heard it. Some of the older ones had heard it so many times they could recite it by heart. But Richard told it differently this time. He told it slowly. He included details he'd never shared before, like the fact that his mother cried when he gave her the discount store coat. Not because she was disappointed. Because she knew he'd spent everything he had. She cried because she knew what it cost me, Richard said. Not the money. The dignity of walking into a place and being told I didn't belong there. And then Richard said, last week, I walked into 3 of our stores. And I was told I didn't belong there. The room went silent. He pulled out a photograph, a large printed photo of himself in the disguise, and held it up. This is me, he said. Last Tuesday. In this store. On this floor. 11 days ago. You could hear the air leave the room. 300 people inhaling at the same time. Richard spent the next 45 minutes going through what happened. Every interaction. Every redirect. Every invented policy. Every force field of avoidance. Every casual joke behind a partition. He was specific. He used names. He described scenes with the precision of a documentary filmmaker. And as he talked, something shifted in the room. It started as shock. Then it moved to shame. Then to something harder to name, a kind of collective reckoning. The uncomfortable realization that they all knew. Maybe not the specifics. But the culture. The unwritten rules. The way things actually worked versus the way they were supposed to work. Everyone in that room had seen a version of what Richard described. And most of them had participated in it. Or at least looked the other way. When Richard finished describing the 3 days, he paused. A long pause. The kind of pause that makes 300 people stop breathing. And then he said, I have a decision to make. And I want to make it in front of all of you. Because you deserve to know what's coming and why. He looked at Derek Holloway, who was sitting in the 3rd row. Derek, he said. You've been with this company for 12 years. And for some portion of those 12 years, you've been running a system that directly contradicts everything this company stands for. You've been redirecting people out of our stores based on how they look. And you've been doing it quietly enough that it never appeared on any report I've ever seen. Derek's face was white. Not from fear. From exposure. The thing he'd been doing in the dark was suddenly standing in the light. You're fired, Richard said. Effective immediately. Then he looked at Christine Park on the video screen. Christine. You directed me to a homeless shelter. In my own store. You're fired. Then Jennifer. You invented a policy that doesn't exist to prevent me from looking at a watch. You're fired. Then he paused again. And what he said next is the part that people don't expect. The part that changes everything. He said, now. I need to talk about Marcus Williams. The room shifted. People looked around, found Marcus sitting near the back. Marcus, who had been listening to all of this with wide eyes, suddenly looked like a deer caught in very bright headlights. Marcus, Richard said. Stand up. Marcus stood. Marcus was the only person in this store who treated me like a human being. He said good morning. He asked if I was warm. He told me about the coffee machine. He said it was free for everyone, not customers, everyone. And when Derek Holloway told him to redirect me, Marcus ignored that order. Murmurs in the room. Some people looked at Derek. Derek was staring at the floor. "Marcus," Richard continued, "I'd like to offer you the position of floor manager at this store. Effective immediately. With a salary increase that reflects the role." And the room erupted. Applause. Tears. 300 people releasing the tension of the last hour all at once. Marcus was shaking. Actually physically shaking. And this is the part of the story that went viral. This is the moment that got clipped and shared and reposted and turned into a motivational meme with cursive font and a sunset background. The millionaire rewards the good employee. Justice is served. The end. Except, that's not the end. And this is where I need you to really listen. Because what happened after that meeting, what happened in the weeks and months that followed, is the part of this story that nobody talks about. And it's the part that contains the actual lesson. Because the plot twist isn't that Richard found one good employee. The plot twist is what happened to that employee. And what happened to Richard. And what happened to the entire company. Let me tell you. The day after the meeting, Marcus Williams was officially promoted to floor manager. His salary went from $42,000 a year to $78,000. He could now afford to bring his mother to live with him and his grandmother. He cried when he signed the paperwork. His grandmother cried. His mother, when he called her, cried. It was, by every measure, the happiest day of Marcus's professional life. It lasted about 3 weeks. Because here's what nobody anticipated. When you publicly elevate someone as the moral example, when you stand them up in front of 300 people and say, "This person is what you should all be," you don't just give them a promotion. You give them a target. The other employees didn't see Marcus as an inspiration. They saw him as an accusation. His existence in that role was a daily reminder that they had failed the test. Every time Marcus walked the floor, every time he gave an instruction, every time he made a decision, the subtext was always there. "I'm here because I was better than you. I passed the test you failed." Marcus didn't think that way. Marcus didn't act that way. Marcus was the same person he'd always been, warm, humble, hardworking. But it didn't matter what Marcus thought. It mattered what everyone else projected onto him. Within 2 months, Marcus was managing a floor where half the staff resented him, a quarter were afraid to make any decision without checking with him first, because they were terrified of failing another test, and the remaining quarter had simply checked out emotionally. The floor's performance numbers started dropping. Not dramatically, but steadily. The warmth that Marcus naturally embodied, the same warmth that had made him say "good morning" to a stranger in a dirty jacket, was being suffocated by the weight of being a symbol. He wasn't Marcus the person anymore. He was Marcus the lesson. The walking, talking reminder of everyone else's shame. And the external pressure was even worse. The story had leaked. Of course it had. Someone in that meeting recorded parts of it on their phone. Within a week, it was on social media. Within a month, it was a national news story. Billionaire disguises as homeless man, fires employees who failed the test. The internet did what the internet does. It turned a complicated, nuanced human situation into a binary morality tale. Richard was either a hero or a villain. The fired employees were either monsters or victims. And Marcus was either a saint or a prop. The comment sections were brutal. Some people called Richard a genius. Others called him a manipulative billionaire playing poverty tourism. Easy to test people when you can take off the costume and go back to your mansion, one viral comment read. And that comment, that one hurt Richard. Because it was partially true. He did get to take off the costume. He did get to go back to his life. The discomfort he experienced was temporary and voluntary. For actual homeless people, there's no makeup artist waiting to peel off the disguise. There's no driver waiting 2 blocks away. There's no meeting where everything gets resolved and the good person gets rewarded. The criticism forced Richard to confront something he hadn't considered, that his experiment, however well-intentioned, was built on a fundamental asymmetry of power. He could play at being powerless. But he was never actually powerless. Not for a single second. And the people he tested? They were genuinely powerless. Derek, Christine, Jennifer, all fired publicly, their names now associated with a viral story about prejudice. They didn't just lose their jobs. They lost their reputations. Their careers in retail were essentially over. And here's the part that really complicates things. Because 3 months after the firings, a journalist named Sarah Kessler from the Chicago Tribune published a long investigative piece about the Albridge incident. And what she uncovered changed everything. Sarah interviewed Derek Holloway. And Derek told her something that Richard didn't know. Something that nobody in the meeting knew. The redirect system? Derek didn't invent it. He inherited it. It had been in place, informally, since at least 2011, 3 years before Derek became floor manager. The previous floor manager, a man named Thomas Brennan, had implemented it. And Thomas Brennan had implemented it because he had been told to by the regional director at the time, a woman who had since retired and moved to Florida. The redirect system wasn't Derek's innovation. It was the company's culture. Derek just happened to be the one holding the hot potato when the music stopped. And Christine Park? Sarah interviewed her too. Christine explained, and her account was corroborated by 3 other managers at different stores, that she had actually flagged concerns about how non-purchasing visitors were treated at a regional meeting in 2016. She had specifically asked for clearer guidelines on how to handle situations where someone entered the store who appeared to be homeless or in distress. She was told, by a regional VP, to use her judgment and prioritize the comfort of paying customers. Christine interpreted that guidance the way she thought she was supposed to. Was she wrong? Absolutely. Was she operating in a vacuum? No. She was operating inside a system that gave her ambiguous instructions and then punished her for following them. And Jennifer, the associate who invented the policy about needing manager approval for watches over $10,000? Sarah found out that a version of that policy actually did exist at one point. It had been implemented informally in 2014 after a shoplifting incident and was never officially rescinded. Jennifer wasn't making it up out of thin air. She was half remembering a real practice that had been passed down through employee word of mouth. The Tribune article was devastating. Not to the employees Richard fired. To Richard. Because it revealed that the rot he discovered wasn't a failure of individual character. It was a failure of organizational structure. Of leadership. Of the systems and incentives and informal practices that accumulate over decades when the person at the top steps back and trusts that the culture will maintain itself. The culture didn't maintain itself. Cultures never do. They require constant, active, intentional maintenance. And Richard, by his own admission, had stopped maintaining it years ago. He had delegated the soul of his company to spreadsheets and satisfaction scores and quarterly reviews. And those tools couldn't measure what mattered most, whether a young woman at a greeting podium would look up from her phone. Whether a security guard would follow a stranger through a store. Whether a floor manager would use the word redirect instead of remove and believe there was a meaningful difference. The article forced Richard into a painful reckoning. He had publicly fired 3 people for a cultural failure that he was ultimately responsible for. He had used his power to punish individuals for a systemic problem. And he had done it in front of 300 people, with cameras rolling, in a moment that felt like justice but was actually performance. Not intentional performance. Richard wasn't trying to create a viral moment. But the effect was the same. He punished the visible symptoms while the disease, his own absence, his own complacency, his own failure to maintain the culture he'd built, went undiagnosed. And here's where the story turns one final time. Because what Richard did next is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. It would have been easy for Richard to ignore the Tribune article. He was a billionaire. The public was mostly on his side. The fired employees had no power and no platform. He could have moved on, let the story fade, and continued running his company with the warm glow of being the millionaire who stood up for the little guy. Instead, Richard did something that almost nobody does. He admitted he was wrong. Publicly. In a letter that was published in the Tribune, in a full-page ad in 4 national newspapers, and on the company's website. The letter was 2,000 words long. And the core of it was this: he said that he had made a profoundly flawed decision by firing Derek, Christine, and Jennifer. He said that while their behavior was unacceptable, it was a product of a culture that he had failed to protect. He said that punishing individuals for systemic failures was the coward's version of accountability. And then he did 3 things. First, he offered all 3 fired employees their jobs back, with back pay for every day they were out of work, plus a significant financial settlement. Derek accepted and returned to a different role, not floor manager, but a senior training position focused on exactly the issues that had been exposed. Christine declined the offer. She had already taken a position at another company. Jennifer also declined. She had moved to a different city. She told Sarah Kessler that she couldn't go back to a place where everyone would forever associate her with that story. Second, Richard created what he called the Albridge Foundation for Dignity in Service. He funded it with $50 million of his own money. The foundation's mission was to work with retail companies, restaurants, hotels, and service businesses across the country to address exactly the kind of invisible bias that his experiment had exposed. Not through tests and gotcha moments. Through training, structural change, and ongoing accountability. And third, and this is the part that nobody saw coming, Richard stepped down as chairman of the board. Not because he was forced to. Not because of shareholder pressure. But because he concluded that the most honest thing he could do, after holding his employees accountable for a failure that started with him, was to hold himself accountable too. He said in his resignation letter, "I built this company on the belief that every person deserves to be seen. And then I stopped looking." Now, Marcus. We need to talk about Marcus. Because Marcus's story doesn't end with the promotion. Remember, Marcus was struggling. The promotion had turned him into a symbol, and the weight of that symbol was crushing him. His performance reviews, which had been stellar for 2 years, started showing cracks. He was second-guessing every decision. He couldn't sleep. He started having anxiety attacks before his shifts. And he never told anyone. Because how do you complain about a miracle? How do you say, "The best thing that ever happened to me is destroying me," without sounding ungrateful? How do you tell the man who changed your life that the way he changed it is breaking you? Marcus held it together for 14 months. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon in January of 2020, Marcus Williams walked into the store manager's office and resigned. He didn't make a scene. He didn't explain. He just said, "I think it's time for me to go." The store manager, who was new and didn't fully understand the weight of Marcus's history with the company, tried to talk him out of it. Marcus smiled, that same warm, genuine smile that had made Richard Albridge see him as the embodiment of everything good about his company, and said, "I need to be somewhere where I'm just Marcus." That line. I need to be somewhere where I'm just Marcus. When Richard heard about it, and he heard about it the same day, because people still told him things, he sat in his study at home and he cried. Not for the company. Not for the culture. Not for the principal. For Marcus. For the 24-year-old kid from the South Side who had done the right thing for the right reason and had been rewarded in a way that slowly, quietly, invisibly turned his life into something he needed to escape from. Richard called Marcus that evening. The conversation lasted 2 hours. And at the end of it, Richard said, "I owe you an apology." Marcus said, "For what?" And Richard said, "For making you a symbol when you were already something better. You were a person." Marcus took 6 months off. He traveled. He saw his mother, who was doing well in the apartment he'd gotten for her, the deposit he'd paid with his elevated salary. He read books. He went to therapy. Not because anything was clinically wrong with him, but because he wanted to understand why doing the right thing had felt so much heavier than he expected it to. And then Marcus did something that brings this whole story full circle. He enrolled in a hospitality management program. He graduated in 2022. And he opened a small restaurant on the south side of Chicago. Nothing fancy. A place that serves breakfast and lunch. Good food, fair prices, clean tables. And on the wall near the entrance, not in a frame, not with a spotlight, just taped there with regular tape, slightly crooked, there's a small handwritten sign that says, "Everyone who walks through this door is our most important guest today." He didn't credit Richard Albridge. He didn't reference the first face policy. He didn't tell the story to reporters when they came around asking. He just lives it. Every day. Quietly. Without cameras. Without tests. Without disguises. And that is the lesson. Not the one you expected. Not be kind to everyone because you never know who's watching. That's the shallow version. That's the fortune cookie. The real lesson is this: systems don't maintain themselves. Values don't survive on autopilot. You cannot build something beautiful and then walk away and expect it to stay beautiful. Every principle you hold requires daily maintenance. Every culture you create requires constant, active, intentional tending, like a garden that will absolutely, inevitably return to weeds the moment you stop pulling them. And when things go wrong, when the weeds take over, the answer is not to find the nearest person and blame them for not pulling weeds while you were gone. The answer is to look at your own hands and ask why they've been clean for so long. Richard Albridge is 82 years old now. He still visits the Albridge stores occasionally. Not in disguise. Just as himself. An old man in a nice coat, walking through the departments, watching employees interact with customers. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, he walks into Marcus's restaurant on the south side. He orders the eggs and toast. He sits by the window. And Marcus brings him coffee without being asked. They don't talk about what happened. They don't need to. They both know the same truth. You don't test people to find out who they are. You build the conditions where they can be who they want to be. And then you stay. You stay and you tend the garden. You stay and you maintain the culture. You stay and you do the work. Because the moment you leave, the moment you step back and assume it'll run itself, that's when the woman at the podium stops looking up. That's when the security guard becomes a shadow. That's when redirect becomes a policy nobody wrote down but everyone follows. And that's when the guy in the dirty jacket with $420 in his pocket walks out the door. And nobody even notices he was there.